So we thank you very much for participating with us over the next 2 days. And of course, as the speakers conclude with their presentations, we'd like you to ask as many questions as you'd like. Now, I'm going to start off before you get sick of me, and I'm going to go into my next presentation, which discusses the demographics of LNG demand. Now, I'm going to take the previous theme that I discussed and take it a bit forward. I'm going to focus upon the Gulf natural gas sector and see what implications that has for global LNG trade. Now, what I'd like us to do, I'd just like us to imagine in a period of 30 years, just for the region, what occurred. The GCC has engaged in a wide-ranging revolution in terms of the natural gas sector. Now, if we consider that in 1977, the GCC, well, the GCC didn't exist then, but the Gulf as a region, began to export gas from the UAE. And the UAE built the region's first LNG terminal, which exported LNG to Japan. Now, if we fast forward, just a mere 30 years later, in August of 2009, the GCC began to import natural gas. This is when Kuwait began to import cargoes, LNG cargoes, from as far afield as Russia's Sakhalin field. Now, this quite little noticed event underscores the significant issues confronting the Gulf countries as they are bound up with economic and industrial diversification, as well as job creation for the demographic boom, as much as it is powering the lights in the region. So importing gas into the GCC, of course, seems a bit counterintuitive, as the GCC holds a quarter of the global gas reserves. But at the same time, this demand-supply imbalance has forced all the GCC countries, with the exception of Qatar, to think about gas importation schemes, to at least consider it if they haven't already done it. But before going into that aspect, I think it would be fruitful to give some background on the causes of the GCC gas supply-demand imbalance and discuss how it came to be. Now, these issues are quite topical for the region, and it concerns, as I indicated earlier, nearly every GCC country except for Qatar. Now, number one, there has been an extreme increase in domestic power and gas demand across the region for about the past decade. Now, from 1998 into 2008, the GCC economies grew at a rate of approximately 7.6% per annum. Now, the demand in the power and gas sectors, of course, kept pace with the regional economic growth and industrial diversification. With gas demand, which tracked that economic growth, which grew approximately 5.5%, and also electricity demand, which grew at about 6.2% over the same time period. Now, if we look at the forecasts from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the forecast basically estimates that the GCC power needs are going to increase by about 50% going forward, from approximately 710 terawatt hours in 2010 to approximately 1,100 terawatt hours in 2030. Now, this is a fairly significant increase, and there are questions as to how this increase is going to be fueled. Now, more than 90% of this increase is likely to be fueled by reliance upon natural gas, but also other alternative fuels in the region are being considered at the same time. If we look at the UAE, there has been a consideration of utilizing coal, nuclear, and also in other GCC countries, they have focused on promoting nuclear development as well, although Kuwait has recently stepped back from that program. And then also there's been a focus regionally on renewable energy, which even a country like Saudi Arabia, which is the world's #1 premier oil exporting country, has at least announced that it will be dependent upon natural gas for power generation. Now, cause number two, there's been a governmental focus on industrial diversification, such as the steel, aluminum, and petrochemical sector. So the GCC, over the past few decades, has made enormous strides in economic diversification and also economic modernization. And it has been attempting to move away from merely exporting primary products, basically, as you all know, products which are not, or commodities which are not value added, to exporting value added goods. Now, these sectors are only slated to grow in the future as the GCC countries continue to take quite bold steps to expand their diversification plans and significantly invest in their gas and energy-intensive industries. However, there's one potential obstacle in these plans, and this obstacle has actually served to facilitate and enable much of this industrial diversification, and that has been the region's fairly low domestic natural gas price. Now, it's a below market price. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to call it a subsidy as some do, which actually it's not if you look at what a subsidy actually is, but it is below international market prices, and as a result, it has served to disincentivize investment in many of the GCC countries in terms of the natural gas sector. But it has given many of the GCC industries quite a competitive advantage over their global competitors. And it has given rise, though, to questions as to whether this industrial diversification, which is based upon the gas molecule, is sustainable for the future. In particular, if we look at the fact that it's premised on this fairly low internal gas price. So whether most of the GCC countries outside of Qatar will be able to continue with their industrial diversification plans based on its extremely low natural gas price is really a question that does not have an answer as of yet. And there's also another issue, is whether many of the Gulf countries, by granting their domestic industrial sectors such low natural gas price, whether in effect they are passing on these cost savings to the petrochemical consumers in industrialized countries. So that's also another issue that should be considered as to whether these plans can continue to proceed. Now, cause number 3 is gas exploration and production challenges. Now, of course, as I indicated, these are the reasons as to why the gas demand supply imbalance has been increasing in the region. Now, the subpoint of this is, of course, the OPEC quotas that were installed in 2008 in effect to institute or implement a price floor in the international price of oil. Although this had a problem for many of the GCC countries, because at that time they faced more or less an existential challenge, you could say. And that challenge was whether the countries are more or less gas producing countries or whether they are oil exporting countries. And why do I say this? As we all know, most of the natural gas in the region is produced by associated natural gas, of course, outside of the North Field. So because of that, when there is a drop, such as the institution of an OPEC quota, this does lower the country's production of associated natural gas, which thereby throws off these industrialization and diversification plans that I mentioned earlier. It makes them skewed. There has also been troubles finding gas, and the new sources of unassociated gas in the region have been difficult to find. Now, Saudi Arabia has had limited success in finding unassociated natural gas, although there was an announcement this past March whereby apparently significant amounts of shale gas have been found in the kingdom, in particular in the region that is known as Ruba al-Khali, the empty quarter, of course, in the southeast of the country. But as of yet, this gas has not been developed or have come online, and we haven't really heard much after this announcement. And there are also certain questions as to how this shale gas would even be produced, considering that there is an extremely low domestic price within the kingdom, and additionally, as we all know, producing shale gas requires a fairly significant amount of water to produce, and for countries such as Saudi Arabia, that would add obviously production costs to that project. And then also the third topic of this is that the issue of technically challenging gas. Now, technical challenges are immense with much of the unassociated gas fields that have been found within the region, and it, of course, adds to the production costs as well as to some of the environmental concerns to these projects. So, of course, if we add to the fact that the GCC gas prices are administratively set, that means that most of the internal gas prices in the region are not subject to market forces. Instead, they are more or less set by policy, and these gas prices may not reflect the cost of producing producing from these unassociated and unconventional gas fields. So if we look at the average price regionally, which is about $1.50 per MMBTU, if we look at this low price combined with the policy of privileging new gas projects to the domestic market, has caused more than a few IOCs to look askance at developing some of these gas fields. Now, this is one of the major reasons, of course, for the lack of gas production in the region, in which I indicated earlier the region has a quarter of the world's natural gas reserves, but as of yet, only about 8% of the global utilization or production. Now, to move on to the next cause as to the gas supply demand imbalance, it's the issue of mature gas fields and the need for natural gas and EOR, so enhanced oil recovery. And this has been another significant source within the region for gas consumption. Of course, the gas which is needed for reinjection, and also the gas needed to maintain the reservoir pressure and oil production capacity. So if I'm just give an example so that we can understand the full context of this issue. If we take the UAE, for example, in 2008, gas demand for reinjection was quite significant, and it reached about 18 BCM within the Emirates. 18 BCM. Now, of course, this is in a country which is still exporting LNG due to its long-term commitments. And then at the same time, it is also importing LNG from both the Dolphin natural gas pipeline and also from LNG import. So we can see that if there are substantive steps that are taken to at least alleviate this domestic gas consumption from EOR, we can see that these rates are slated to increase. And some of the forecasts that I have conducted when I was at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies show that if some of the same trends remain the same in a country such as the UAE, we can expect that the consumption arising from EOR by 2020 will reach about 45 BCM just within the UAE itself. Now, of course, this is a significant increase if steps are not taken. Although at the moment the UAE has been experimenting with utilizing carbon for reinjection as well as nitrogen, but as of yet, the lion's share belongs to natural gas. Now, this particular policy that I indicated may work in a weak oil demand environment, but in the long term it's simply unsustainable, as oil fields could be damaged if there is a prolonged lack of gas reinjection. So more or less, if the countries attempt to privilege, let's say, OPEC quotas over producing natural gas from these reservoirs, and thereby also harming their ability to produce additional amounts of oil from these mature oil fields. And lastly, there is the issue of long-term gas export commitments that serve to limit local supply. Now, of course, this is not an issue for Qatar, but if we look at Qatar's neighbors that export natural gas, such as Oman and the UAE, this is a fairly significant issue. If we look at the UAE and Oman, there are fairly significant amounts of their natural gas production, which is geared for export through long-term contracts to the UAE, to the EU and Asia. Now, these export commitments only serve to exacerbate contracts, because then there are all sorts of implications in terms of the trust that the business community has for the UAE and Oman. Now, just to give a brief word about the Gulf unconventional gas, which I stated earlier. Now, if we look at the UAE, whereby most of the unconventional gas, of course, is sulfurous, and the rates of sulfur in UAE gas, if we look at, for instance, the Shah natural gas field, these rates are about 25 to 30% of sulfur. So this does imply significant challenges in terms of producing this natural gas and processing it and so on. And not only that, it's going to add immensely to the production costs. So then the question is, how can this domestic gas pricing framework remain in place of roughly about $1.20 per MMBTU when the production costs are several-fold higher? So that's within the coming years, we're going to start to see a fair amount of stress, which is placed between the production cost of these new natural gas fields and then also the domestic price within many of the Gulf countries. Now, if we look at Kuwaiti gas, the Kuwaiti gas tends to be ultra deep. Now that means that Kuwaiti gas extends to about 15,000 feet or so beneath the ground. Now that's quite significant, of course, and this as well implies significant production costs. And then also much of the new gas fields in Oman are ultra tight. They are tight gas fields, and then in order to extract the gas from limestone and sandstone, this also is a bit challenging, and it also does increase the production costs. Now, if we look at the shale gas announcement in Saudi Arabia, now, of course, the initial estimate may not necessarily prove to be accurate later on, but at least initially, it would apparently double the reserves of Saudi Arabia from 7.5 trillion cubic meters to about 15 trillion cubic meters. Now, during this announcement, of course, the international media was quite, fairly hummed about it and was quite excited. Although I think that this impact is not likely to be great unless there is a significant reconfiguration of the gas pricing framework. And frankly, it has to be done in order to incentivize gas production, not only in Saudi Arabia, but across the region. And basically, this would have to take a significant phasing out of the administrative pricing, leaning perhaps more to the export pricing model, or at least production cost. Otherwise, it would simply be extremely difficult to extract this natural gas in the region out of the ground. Now, it's more or less due to this pricing model, which to a large extent is a reason for the current GCC gas shortage. And more or less this shortage is about 19 BCM, and it's forecast to increase by about 31 BCM in 2015. Now, this is going to, of course, increase as to whether the Gulf countries are going to proceed apace with their industrialization programs, or whether they are going to attempt to diversify their economies, because even these diversification attempts are still predicated on utilizing the energy sector. In a sense, if we look at the value-added industries, such as petrochemicals, fertilizers, or if we look at the energy-intensive industries, such as cement, or if we look at aluminum smelting or what have you. So these are some of the challenges going forward in terms of the Gulf gas sector, and this, of course, is going to impact the global LNG market, as many of the Gulf countries, if there's not some substantive change or seismic shift that occurs, are going to begin to import ever larger sums of LNG, whereby we could see a region that has significant natural gas reserves is going to overall become an LNG importing region, which of course would have quite significant ramifications going forward. So I'd like to thank you for your kind attention, and I'm available for any questions. Okay, and also I'm also available as well throughout the conference. Now, what I would like to do is I'd like to introduce our next speaker. We have Mr. Hakan Werner. If he can please come. Has he arrived yet?
Yes,
great. Okay, excellent. And just to give a brief introduction to Mr. Werner, who of course represents IM Skelgen SE. He is One moment. Yes, Hecker Warner is a member of the management team and the Vice President of Business Development, LNG of IM Skogen, SC since 2011. And he was previously the division head at Stoffers and the Business Development Manager at BOC Group. He holds his MBA from the International Institute for Management Development and MSc, and he has an MSc Material Technology from Kungliga Tekniska Högskolan. Sorry for butchering that, but I think we get the point. But my Danish? I'm Swedish. Swedish. Okay, my Swedish is not too good. But please.